It had been 10 months since I moved to Boise, Idaho, and no one in my family noticed. No calls, no texts, not even the kind of accidental message you send when you scroll past the wrong contact. My name had simply slipped out of their routine, like it had never belonged there in the first place. Then my phone lit up. Dad. I stared at the screen longer than I should have. The name looked unfamiliar, like it belonged to someone I used to know, rather than someone who was supposed to know me. The call rang once, twice, 3 times. I didn't reach for it right away. 10 months. That was how long it had taken for him to remember I existed. I answered on the 4th ring. You need to come home next weekend. No. Hello? No. How have you been? Just a command, delivered in the same flat tone he'd used when I was a teenager, and still lived under his roof in San Diego. I leaned back in my chair and looked out the window of my apartment. A narrow stretch of pine trees lined the edge of the parking lot, their branches barely moving in the late afternoon wind. Why, I asked. There was a pause, short and impatient. Your brother's wedding, he said. We need you there. Of course we do. Not because they missed me. Not because anyone had wondered where I'd gone or why I'd packed up my life and left California without a word. Just because now there were people watching. Ethan's getting married, I said, more to fill the silence than out of surprise. Yes, and Isla's family is very particular. They expect a certain image. His voice tightened slightly, like he was already bracing for resistance. We need to look like a complete family. A complete family. I let that sit between us for a second. 10 months of silence, and suddenly I was required again. Not as a daughter, not even as a person, just as something that filled a space in a photograph. I won't be there, I said. Another pause. Longer this time. What do you mean you won't be there? I kept my eyes on the trees outside, on the way the light caught along the edges of the needles. Something about the stillness made it easier to speak without second-guessing myself. I mean exactly that. You don't understand, he said, his tone sharpening. This is important. For Ethan, for all of us, for all of us. I almost smiled. I had moved out of my apartment in San Diego on a Tuesday morning in early spring, packed everything I owned into a rented truck, drove 12 hours north, signed a lease in a city where no one knew my name, built a life that didn't depend on whether anyone at that table remembered to look up when I walked into a room. And not once, had anyone from my family asked where I was. But now it mattered. Now it reflected on them. You didn't notice when I left, I said quietly. Why does it matter now? There was a shift on the other end of the line. Not silence, exactly. More like the air tightening the way it does before something breaks. That's not the point, he said. It was exactly the point. I didn't say that out loud. Not yet. I just sat there, phone pressed to my ear, listening to the faint hum of the line, and for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel like I was the one who had disappeared. I felt like I was the one who had finally stepped out of the frame, and they had only just noticed the empty space. The call ended, but the silence it left behind didn't feel the same. It wasn't the hollow kind I had grown used to over the past 10 months. This one felt heavier, like something had been dropped into still water and hadn't settled yet. I set my phone face down on the kitchen counter and reached for the kettle. The motion was automatic. Fill it. Turn it on. Wait. The small routines I had built here had a way of anchoring me, even when something tried to pull me backward. Outside the window, the same row of pine trees stretched along the edge of the lot, their green sharp against the pale sky. Boise didn't have the constant hum of San Diego. No ocean noise, no traffic that never quite faded. Just space, air, quiet that belonged to you if you chose it. I hadn't realized how much I needed that until I had it. My apartment wasn't anything special. 1 bedroom, slightly outdated cabinets, a narrow balcony that barely fit 2 chairs. But everything in it was mine. The mismatched dishes, the second-hand couch I'd found online, the small herb pots lined up along the window, basil, thyme, rosemary, each one alive, because I remembered to water them, because I noticed. That thought came and went quickly, but it stayed just long enough to sting. My laptop was still open on the table where I'd been working before the call. A spreadsheet filled the screen, rows of numbers. I had spent the morning organizing for a shipment schedule. I worked as a logistics coordinator for a regional distribution company. It wasn't glamorous, but it was steady, predictable in a way that didn't depend on anyone's mood or attention. When something needed to be tracked, it was tracked. When something was missing, someone asked why. I closed the laptop gently and leaned against the counter, wrapping my hands in the mug. Once the kettle clicked off, the warmth seeped into my fingers, grounding me in a way the conversation hadn't. My phone buzzed once. A text this time. Not from my parents. "Maya, you still on for lunch tomorrow?" she wrote. I smiled faintly, typing back a quick yes. Maya worked in the same office, a few desks over. She had a way of asking simple questions that didn't feel like obligations. Just choices. Invitations that didn't carry a hidden expectation. It had taken me a while to get used to that. Another buzz followed a few minutes later. This one I didn't have to flip the phone over to recognize. Grandma. Evelyn Whitmore never waited long between calls, but she also never made them feel urgent. She didn't demand answers. She didn't assume anything. She just checked in the way people do when they actually want to know. I answered on the first ring. "Hi, sweetheart," she said, her voice steady and familiar. "How's the weather up there today?" I looked out at the trees again, at the way the late afternoon light filtered through the branches. "Quiet," I said. "Cool. It's nice." We talked for a few minutes about nothing in particular. The plants on my windowsill, the way the air felt different here. She asked if I was sleeping well, if work was steady. Questions that had answers she actually waited to hear. She didn't mention my parents, not right away. She never rushed into things like that. When we hung up, I stayed by the window a little longer, watching the light shift as the sun dipped lower. The apartment settled around me in that familiar, steady way. No one knocking on the door. No one calling my name from another room. No background noise I had to tune out just to think. Just the quiet I had chosen. 10 months ago, I had packed everything I owned into a truck and driven north without telling anyone. Not out of anger, not even out of defiance, just because there was nothing left to explain. And for 10 months, that choice had gone unnoticed. Until now, I picked up my phone again, turning it over in my hand. The screen was dark, but I could still feel the weight of the call, sitting there, waiting. They hadn't seen my life. They hadn't asked about it. But somehow, they expected to step into it, like nothing had changed. I set the phone back down more carefully this time and took a slow sip of tea. The quiet returned steady and familiar, but it wasn't untouched anymore. The next morning, the call replayed in my head before I even opened my eyes. Not the whole thing, just the way he'd said it. "We need you there." Not "we miss you." Not "it would mean a lot." Just need, like I was a piece of something that had been misplaced and suddenly mattered again, because someone had noticed the gap. I lay there for a moment, staring at the ceiling, letting the quiet of the apartment settle around me again. The same quiet from yesterday. But it didn't feel as untouched. It felt observed now, by people who hadn't been looking until it was inconvenient not to. I pushed myself out of bed and moved through my morning the way I always did. Coffee, shower, laptop open by 7:30. The rhythm didn't change even if something underneath it had shifted. At work, the numbers lined up the way they were supposed to. Shipments routed, delays accounted for. Problems identified and solved before they could grow into something bigger. That was the part I liked. When something didn't make sense, you traced it back. You followed the pattern until you found where it broke. You didn't ignore it and pretend it wasn't there. Around mid-morning, my phone lit up again. "Dad." I let it ring. It stopped, then started again. I muted it this time and turned the screen face down beside my keyboard. The spreadsheet in front of me stayed open, but my eyes weren't on it anymore. 10 months without a word, and now 2 calls in less than 24 hours. Not because anything had changed for me, because something had changed for them. I didn't pick up. Instead, I clicked through a few tabs, pulling up an old email thread I hadn't looked at in a while. It wasn't anything important at the time. Just a forwarded message from my mom months back. I hadn't even opened it when it came in. Now I did. It was short. A group message originally sent between my parents and someone else's names I didn't recognize about Ethan. We're finalizing the guest list my mom had written. Just immediate family and a few close connections. Keeping things clean and simple. The timestamp was from 3 months ago. Immediate family. I stared at the words longer than I needed to. No mention of me. Not even as an afterthought. No follow-up asking if I could attend. No, we'll let Lena know. Just gone from the definition entirely. I leaned back slowly in my chair, letting the realization settle without pushing it too far. It wasn't proof of anything new. It was just confirmation of something that had always been there. My phone buzzed again. This time, a voicemail notification. Then a text. Call me back. This is important. I didn't open it. The office around me carried on as usual. Keys tapping. Someone laughing softly a few desks over. Maya passed by with a stack of folders and gave me a quick smile, like everything was normal. And on the surface it was. I reached for my coffee, now lukewarm, and took a sip. They hadn't planned for me to be there, not at first. That much was clear. Whatever version of the story they were trying to build now, it hadn't included me until recently. Until something or someone made my absence noticeable. I didn't know what that was yet, but I could feel it, like a loose thread, starting to pull at the edge of something bigger. I turned my phone over again, the screen lighting up under my hand. Another message. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. I watched the words for a second, then set the phone back down. Carefully, deliberately. I didn't respond. Not yet. But for the first time since the call, I wasn't just hearing what they were asking. I was starting to notice what they weren't saying. And that felt like the beginning of something I couldn't quite name yet. By Thursday afternoon, the messages had stopped sounding like requests. They had started sounding like instructions. My phone lit up twice, before lunch, then again, while I was in a meeting. I didn't check them right away. I had learned over the years that urgency was often something people created when they wanted control. Still, the notifications stacked up. Dad, Mom, Ethan. I waited until the end of the day to look. 3 texts from my mother. Sweetheart, this isn't like you. Your brother really needs you there. We're counting on you. The wording was careful, softer than my father's. But underneath it, the same assumption sat quietly in place. That I would adjust. That I always had. I set the phone down and leaned back in my chair, letting the office empty out around me. Maya had already left for the day, waving on her way out, her voice light and casual, as she reminded me about lunch tomorrow. Normal, that word kept coming back. Not the kind of normal I had grown up with. Not the kind that required you to shrink yourself just enough to fit into whatever version of the day someone else had decided was important. A different kind. The kind where no one was waiting for you to fail to show up. My phone buzzed again. This time, it was Ethan. I hesitated before opening it. I don't know what's going on with you, his message read. But can you just come? It's one night. Don't make this bigger than it needs to be. I stared at the screen for a moment, my thumb hovering just above the glass. He wasn't accusing me. He wasn't defending them either. He was smoothing things over, the way he always had. Not stepping in, not stepping away, just keeping things level enough that nothing had to change. I closed the message without replying. Outside, the sky had shifted into that soft gray that came just before evening. The pine trees blurred slightly as the light dropped their outlines, less defined, like something you stopped focusing on if you looked too long. I packed up my things slowly, not because I needed to, but because there was no reason to rush. There never had been. That thought settled into me more firmly than anything else that day. I had never been the reason things moved forward in that house. I had only ever been the piece that was expected to fall into place when needed. When I got back to my apartment, the quiet met me at the door, steady and unchanged. I set my bag down, slipped off my shoes, and moved through the space without turning on the lights right away. The window over the sink still held the last of the evening glow. The herbs sat where I had left them that morning, leaves slightly angled toward the fading light. Everything exactly where I expected it to be, because I had put it there. My phone buzzed again on the counter. Another message from my father. "We've already told people you'll be there." I read it once, then again. There it was. Not a request. Not even pressure dressed up as concern. A decision made without me. I set the phone down slower, this time, my fingers lingering just long enough to feel the weight of it. 3 months ago, they hadn't included me on a guest list. Now, they were telling people I would show up. The shift wasn't subtle. It wasn't even hidden. It was just assumed. I turned on the kitchen light, the soft yellow filling the room, and reached for the kettle again. The same routine as yesterday. The same movements. But the feeling underneath them had changed. It wasn't just about being overlooked anymore. It was about being placed back into something I had already stepped out of. Without being asked, without being seen. I stood there, waiting for the water to heat the quiet, settling around me once more. Only this time, it didn't feel entirely like mine. By Friday evening, they had stopped pretending this was about family. The words still came, wrapped in family language. Of course, respect, support, unity. But the pressure underneath them had sharpened into something cleaner and colder. And once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. I was sitting at my kitchen counter with my laptop open and a takeout container going cold beside me when my mother called. I almost let it go to voicemail. Almost. But something in me wanted to hear how she would say it. I answered without speaking first. "Lena," she said, and her voice carried that careful gentleness she used when she wanted to sound reasonable. "I don't understand why you're doing this." I looked at the dark reflection in the window over the sink. My own face stared back at me, faint and tired around the edges. "Doing what?" "This," she exhaled softly, as if I were forcing her into patience. "Making a point when your brother is the one who's going to suffer for it." There it was again. Not me, never me. Ethan. The event. The image. The inconvenience. I said nothing, and she filled the silence exactly the way I knew she would. "His future in-laws are traditional people," she said. "They notice things. They ask questions. We need this weekend to go smoothly. We need." Always that word. As if my place in their lives only existed when something needed to be arranged around it. "I wasn't needed 10 months ago," I said. She ignored that. "You're his sister," she said, firmer now. "This is not the time to be stubborn." The old script. Same lines, just older voices. Stubborn when I didn't agree. Difficult when I didn't adjust. Cold when I stopped pretending not to notice. I let her finish. Then I told her I wasn't coming. Not angry, not loud, just clear. For a second, she didn't say anything. Then her tone changed in a way that felt more honest than anything else she'd said all week. "If you do this," she said quietly, "people are going to draw conclusions." I almost laughed. They already had. That was the whole problem. When we hung up, I didn't move right away. I just sat there with the phone still in my hand, the room around me dim, except for the small light over the stove and the glow from my laptop screen. A few minutes later, Ethan called. I stared at his name before answering. His voice came through tighter than usual, stripped of its usual, easy neutrality. "I'm trying to understand why you're making this so hard." I leaned back in my chair. "I'm not making anything hard." I said no. "It's one weekend, Lena." "No," I said. "It's not. It's 10 months of silence, and then suddenly I matter, because someone else might notice I'm missing." He didn't answer right away. That pause told me more than his words ever could. He knew, maybe not everything, maybe not in a way he'd ever say out loud, but he knew enough to recognize the truth when he heard it. "You're reading too much into this," he said finally. But there was no force behind it. Maybe, but I didn't think so. After we hung up, I walked to the sink and watered the herbs on the windowsill, even though I had already done it that morning. Basil, thyme, rosemary. Small things with roots that held because someone bothered to tend them. The apartment was quiet again, but it wasn't the same quiet as before. Something had shifted, not out there, in here. All week I had been reacting, receiving, absorbing, measuring each message against years of the same pattern. But standing there in my own kitchen, with the water darkening the soil and the city lights beginning to flicker below the balcony, I understood something with a clarity I hadn't let myself touch before. If I went back now, even for one night, I would be agreeing to the role they had written for me. Not daughter, not sister, not family. Evidence. Proof that the picture still held. I set the watering can down and rested both hands on the counter. That was the moment it became simple. I was not going to help them lie. And once I knew that there was no soft version of this left to return to. Saturday morning came quieter than the rest of the week. No calls when I woke up, no messages waiting. Just the pale light through the window and the faint hum of the city moving somewhere beyond it. For a few minutes, I let myself believe it had settled. That maybe after everything I'd said or not said, they had understood. Then my phone lit up. Dad. I didn't let it ring this time. I picked it up on the first vibration, not out of urgency, but because I was done waiting for the next move to come to me. Lena, he said, and his voice had changed. The flat authority was still there, but the patience underneath it was gone. We need to clear something up. I leaned against the counter, my fingers resting lightly on the edge, grounding myself before I spoke. There's nothing to clear up, I said. I'm not coming. A pause, not hesitation, calculation. You're making a mistake, he said. I didn't answer. You think this doesn't matter, he continued. But it does. This isn't just about a dinner. This is about how this family is seen, how your brother's future is set up. There it was again. Not what had happened, not what hadn't happened for 10 months, just what it looked like. I'm not part of that, I said. You are, he snapped quicker now. Whether you decide to act like it or not. The words hung between us, sharp and familiar. Not new, just louder than before. I could feel the old instinct pressing at the edges of my thoughts. The reflex to soften, to explain, to make it easier for him to understand. I didn't follow it. Instead, I stayed where I was steady. You didn't notice when I left, I said. You didn't ask where I was. You didn't include me. And now you're telling me I'm part of something you didn't even bother to keep me in. That's not what happened, he said quickly. The denial came too fast, too clean. For a second, neither of us spoke. Then his voice shifted again, lower this time, tighter. If you don't show up next weekend, he said, there will be consequences. I didn't move. What kind of consequences, I asked. Another pause, longer now, the kind that builds something before it lands. You'll be out of the will. He said it plainly. No hesitation, no attempt to soften it. Just a statement, placed exactly where he knew it was supposed to carry weight. For a moment, I let the silence sit, not because I didn't understand what he was saying, but because I did. All the way through, this wasn't about family anymore. It wasn't even about the wedding. It was about control, about whether I would step back into a role they could define or stay exactly where I was outside of it. You think that's going to change my mind? I asked. I think you should consider what you're giving up, he said. Everything we've built, everything that was meant to be passed down, everything we've built. I glanced around my kitchen, the counter beneath my hand, the small row of plants in the window, the light coming in, steady and unchanged. Everything I had built. He didn't know any of it. He hadn't asked. I've already considered it, I said. There was a sharp breath on the other end of the line. Not quite anger, not quite disbelief, something closer to resistance. You're overreacting, he said. This doesn't have to turn into something bigger than it is. But it already had, not because of what I was doing, because of what he was refusing to see. I'm not overreacting, I said. I'm just not adjusting anymore. The line went quiet, not disconnected, just held, like he was waiting for me to take something back, to step down, to make it easier. I didn't. After a few seconds, he spoke again, his voice more controlled, but no less firm. Think about it, he said. You still have time to fix this. Fix this. As if what was broken had only just started. As if it hadn't been that way for years. The call ended without goodbye. I stood there for a moment, the phone still in my hand, the silence pressing in again. But it didn't feel uncertain anymore. The stakes were clear now, not just what they wanted, what they were willing to take. I set the phone down slowly and looked back at the window, at the trees that hadn't moved. For the first time all week, nothing about this felt vague. It felt defined, and I knew exactly where I stood. Monday morning didn't feel like a reset. It felt like everything had carried over. The threat from Saturday hadn't faded. It had settled somewhere deeper, like a line that had already been crossed, whether I responded to it or not. I logged into work earlier than usual, the screen lighting up in the dim apartment before the sun had fully come up. The numbers were there waiting. Orders, routes, timelines. Things that could be tracked, adjusted, fixed. Things that followed rules. My phone sat beside the keyboard silent for once, until it wasn't. Dad. Again. I stared at the name for a second, then answered. I assume you've thought about what I said, he began, his tone measured now. Controlled, like he had stepped back from the edge and decided to try a different approach. I have, I said. And I didn't answer right away. I looked out the window instead. The trees were still the early light, just starting to edge through them. This wasn't about convincing him. That part was already over. I'm not coming, I said. A pause, then a quiet exhale. You're really willing to throw everything away over this, he asked. Everything. He kept using that word like it meant the same thing to both of us. I'm not throwing anything away, I said. I'm just not taking something that was never mine to begin with. That's not true, he said quickly. You've always been part of this family. I let that sit there, not arguing it, not agreeing with it, just letting the gap between the words and the reality stay exactly where it was. You didn't include me, I said finally. Not when it mattered. That's not how I remember it. Of course it wasn't. Memory in our family had always been selective. It adjusted itself to whatever version of the story was easiest to maintain. You don't have to remember it the same way, I said. It still happened. There was a shift on the other end of the line. Subtle, but there. The first crack, Lena, he said. And for the first time, there was something under the control. Not concern, not quite frustration, something closer to strain. You're making this bigger than it is. No, I said quietly. You are. I just stopped pretending it was smaller. Silence. Longer this time. Not the kind that waits for an answer. The kind that doesn't have one ready. I felt it then, not victory, not even relief. Just clarity. The kind that doesn't need to be explained to hold. I built my own life. I said, my voice steady. I have a job you've never asked about. I have a home you've never seen. I make more than enough to take care of myself. I paused, not to make it dramatic, but to let it land exactly as it was. I don't need anything from you. The words didn't come out sharp. They didn't need to. On the other end, I could hear him inhale. A small sound, but enough. You're exaggerating, he said, but the certainty was gone. If you had asked, I said you'd know I'm not. That was the sentence. Not louder, not heavier, just true. And it changed something. The space between us shifted, not closed, not resolved, but no longer balanced the way it had been before. He didn't respond right away. When he did, his voice was tighter. This isn't over, he said. You don't get to just step out and act like none of this affects anyone else. I didn't argue, because he was right about one thing. It did affect them, just not in the way they expected. I'm not stepping out, I said. I already did. 10 months ago. Another pause. Then the line went dead. No goodbye, no attempt to call back. Just silence. I set the phone down slowly and looked back at my screen, at the rows of data that hadn't moved. For a moment, everything felt suspended. Not finished, but changed. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be built on the same assumptions anymore. And for the first time, that didn't feel like a loss. By the time the wedding weekend arrived, I understood one thing clearly. Anything I said, they would try to shape. Anything I explained, they would edit into something easier to live with. So on Saturday morning, I stopped thinking about the right response and started thinking about the only thing they couldn't rewrite: my absence. The realization settled over me while I stood in my kitchen with a mug of coffee warming my hands. The apartment was quiet, the kind of quiet that had stopped feeling empty a long time ago. Outside, Boise was bright and cool, early spring light falling across the parking lot and the line of pines beyond it. Somewhere in Austin, my brother was getting married. Somewhere in a hotel lobby or a church hallway, my parents were probably checking their phones, rehearsing explanations, deciding which version of me would be easiest to present to people who had never met me. I looked down at my screen. 3 missed calls, 2 messages from my mother, 1 from Ethan. I didn't open any of them. That was the adjustment, not a dramatic plan, not some clever speech saved for the perfect moment, just the decision not to hand them anything they could use. If they wanted to explain why I wasn't there, they would have to do it without me helping. I turned my phone face down and left it on the counter. Around noon, I drove out toward the foothills, north of the city. Windows cracked just enough to let the air in. I parked near a trailhead Maya had told me about weeks earlier and walked without music, without a podcast, without anything filling the space. Gravel shifted under my shoes. The wind moved through dry grass and low brush. For the first time all a week, my thoughts stopped circling and began to line up. This wasn't about changing their minds. It was about stepping far enough out of reach that they had to stand inside the story they had built without me. By late afternoon, when I got back to the apartment, the light had softened and my phone screen was crowded with notifications. More calls, more messages. 1 voicemail from a number I didn't recognize with an Austin area code. I stared at that one for a moment, not because I planned to call back, because it told me something. The circle had widened. This was no longer contained inside my parents' version of events. A little after 6. Evelyn called. I answered immediately. "Hi, sweetheart," she said, and I could hear the low murmur of people in the background before a door shut and the sound dropped away. "You home?" "I am now." She let out a small breath. "Well, it happened." I leaned against the counter, my hand resting beside the herbs on the windowsill. "How bad?" There was a pause, not for drama, just accuracy. "Not loud," she said, "but noticeable." That sounded right. She told me Ethan had gone through with the ceremony, that my mother had smiled too much, that my father had grown stiffer as the afternoon wore on. Then she got to the part that mattered. Isla's mother, Margaret Harrison, had asked where I was. Not once, more than once. First politely, then directly. My parents had offered different answers. Work, travel, a last-minute issue. Nothing matched cleanly. And Margaret Harrison, according to Evelyn, was not a woman who let inconsistencies drift by just because the flowers were pretty and the music was soft. She noticed, Evelyn said simply. I closed my eyes for a second and let that settle. That was the clue. Not outrage, not collapse, not instant punishment. Just notice, the kind that starts quietly and then refuses to go away. Did Ethan say anything? I asked. Not much, she said. That may have said more than anything else. When we hung up, I stood there for a long moment, looking at the dark screen in my hand. All week, they had acted like my absence was a problem they could manage. Now it belonged to the room, and rooms like that had a way of remembering what didn't fit. By Monday afternoon, the first part of it was already clear. They had not contained the story. I was at my desk, finishing a routing report, when my phone lit up with Evelyn's name. I answered right away, my eyes still on the spreadsheet, until I heard her tone. Not dramatic, not excited, just certain. They're unraveling, she said. I leaned back slowly in my chair. Around me, The office moved in its usual rhythm. Keyboards, low voices, the hum of the printer near the back wall. Normal sounds, steady sounds, the kind that made other people's chaos easier to hear for what it was. "What happened?" I asked. Evelyn didn't rush. She never did. "Margaret Harrison called your mother this morning," she said. "Not to chat, to clarify." I said nothing. "She asked why there were 3 different explanations for your absence. Then she asked why no one had mentioned you until a few weeks before the wedding. Then she asked Ethan directly whether he'd actually spoken to you before any of this." I closed my eyes for a second. That was how it started. Not with a scene, not with shouting, with questions that couldn't be answered cleanly, because the truth underneath them wasn't clean. And I asked, "And your mother tried to smooth it over? Your father tried to make it sound like you were difficult?" Evelyn paused. Margaret didn't seem interested in that version. I looked out the window toward the line of pines beyond the lot, their edges sharp in the pale spring light. Of course she wasn't. People who cared about appearances usually recognized when someone else cared too much about them. "What about Ethan?" I asked. "He's feeling it now," she said. "Isla is too. Her parents don't like gaps in a story, and they like disrespect even less." I could picture it too easily. A polished family event with linen napkins and careful smiles, then one unanswered question, turning the whole table slightly off-center. No one had to accuse anyone of anything. They just had to notice what didn't fit. Evelyn told me Ethan had called the house twice that morning, first angry, then defensive. My parents had gone from denial to damage control in less than 24 hours. They wanted names now. Who in Austin knew me? Who might have said something? Whether I had talked to anyone. As if the problem was a leak. As if truth had to come from somewhere outside of what they had done. I turned my chair slightly away from my desk, lowering my voice, even though no one around me was paying attention. "Did anyone tell them anything?" "No," Evelyn said. "They did that part themselves." That sat with me longer than I expected. All the week, they had treated my absence like something they could manage if they controlled the wording tightly enough. But wording had limits. Once too many versions existed, people stopped listening to the explanation and started studying the inconsistency. That was the part they had missed. You could build a family image on silence for years, but once that silence became visible, it stopped protecting you. My phone buzzed while Evelyn was still on the line. A text from Ethan. "What did you tell them?" I stared at it without opening the thread. Nothing. That was the answer. And somehow, it was the one thing none of them knew how to fight. When I told Evelyn, she gave a quiet sound that might have been a sigh. "They want this to be about disloyalty," she said. That would be easier for them, because then I would be the disruption, the one causing the damage, the one who had changed the story. But I hadn't changed it. I had just stepped out of the version they preferred. After we hung up, I sat still. For a long moment, my hands folded loosely in my lap. The office around me remained unchanged. Reports still needed filing. Trucks still needed routing. My lunch container still sat half-finished beside the keyboard. But somewhere in Austin, the cost had become real. Not dramatic, not final, just real. Their lie was no longer private. And once other people started organizing around that truth, it stopped being something they could pull back into place. My phone buzzed again. Another message from Ethan, then one from my mother, then my father. I turned the screen face down and went back to my report. For the first time since that first call, I wasn't waiting for what they would do next. They already were, and it was finally happening where I didn't have to carry it for them anymore. By the end of that week, the calls had stopped. Not gradually, not fading out the way they had before. Just stopped. No more messages asking what I had said. No more attempts to reframe what had already been seen. No more urgency dressed up as concern. The silence that followed felt different from the one I had left behind 10 months ago. This one wasn't absence. It was consequence. I found out the rest from Evelyn the following Sunday morning, while sunlight stretched across my kitchen counter and the kettle warmed quietly beside me. "They're not talking about you the same way anymore," she said. I leaned against the counter, watching the steam rise in thin lines. "How are they talking about me?" She paused, choosing her words the way she always did, carefully, but without softening them. "They're not," she said. "That's the point." I let that settle. For years, everything had circled around a version of me I didn't recognize. The quiet one, the agreeable one, the one who could be moved, adjusted, placed wherever the picture needed balance. Now there was no version, just a space they couldn't explain. "What about Ethan?" I asked. "He's dealing with it," she said. "Not all at once, but it's not going away." I could picture it. Not the details, not the conversations themselves, but the shape of it. Questions that didn't close. Tension that didn't smooth over with time. A shift in how things were seen, even if no one said it directly. No one had to accuse them. They had already been seen. After we hung up, I stayed where I was for a while, the mug warm in my hands, the apartment steady around me, the same space I had built piece by piece, without anyone asking for proof or permission. Later that week, I signed the final paperwork on a small house just outside the city. Nothing dramatic, just a quiet office, a stack of forms, my name written clearly across each page. No cosigner, no conditions, just mine. When I got the keys, I didn't call anyone. I drove out there alone, parked in the driveway, and sat for a minute with the engine off, looking at the front door. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. Inside, the rooms were empty sunlight, moving slowly across the hardwood floors. I set my bag down in the kitchen and opened the windows, letting the air move through the space. For the first time in a long time, nothing felt like it was waiting to be filled by someone else's expectations. It was already enough. A few days later, Maya came by with takeout and a bottle of wine. We sat on the floor in the living room, laughing about work, about nothing, about things that didn't need to be managed or explained. At some point, she asked, "Do you still talk to your family?" I thought about it for a second. Not about the past week, not about the calls or the messages, or the way everything had shifted once someone outside of it had looked closely enough. Just the question itself. "I don't," I said. It didn't feel heavy. It didn't feel like loss. Just accurate. That night, after she left, I walked through the house once more. Before turning off the lights, the quiet settled in around me, familiar now in a way it hadn't been before. Not something I had escaped into, something I had chosen. I paused by the kitchen window, where I had already set a small row of herbs, basil, thyme, rosemary, just like in the apartment. They would grow here too, because I would notice. I turned off the light and stood there for a second longer, letting the stillness hold. They had wanted me to come back and complete a picture. Instead, they had been left with one they couldn't fix. And I had something better. Not perfect, not easy, but mine. If this story resonates with you, share your thoughts. Have you ever had to choose your own peace over family expectations? If you'd like to hear more stories like this, consider following along. There's always another story waiting.